I don't remember when exactly I first played Ico. I still have my original PS2 North American copy with its generic box art. I think I must have picked it up near the release of the game. The internet tells me there was a demo for it, the kind that used to be included on discs with game magazines. It could have been that, but by the early 2000s I think I was past being regularly exposed to those at friends' houses. It certainly got some enthusiast attention online, or in my friend circles, so it was probably that. While it feels and was a long time ago now, I think even then I was pretty tapped into following game development. Whatever the case, I remember Ico very fondly. Despite that, while I think I've played the game more than once, I don't think I've touched it in well over a decade, if not two. Ahead of the Game Awards last December, I was thinking, could this be the year we see what Fumito Ueda and Gen Design have been working on, finally? Turned out it was, albeit a very brief teaser with all the mystery you'd expect. If I'd already been thinking it was about time I played Ico and its thematic sequels again, this made me certain of it. So, in early 2025, here I am to see how the game holds up and what I think of it all these years later. Ico is an adventure game featuring environmental puzzles, light narrative elements, platforming, and some simple melee combat. It wasn't a big release, but has remained pretty well known. What made it special and captured people's attention? I don't think there were too many narrative or cinematic adventure games out there at the time, but I think what set it apart and stuck with people was the tone and the visuals. It was minimalist, quiet, contemplative, emotional. These are certainly the qualities I remember, and Ico opened my eyes to what games could be in ways I don't think most were. Its unique look and elegance, from its characters to its animation, environments, and puzzles, were fresh and captivating. It reminded me of older games like the original Prince of Persia, Flashback, or Out of This World, but added different emotions. I wanted to play the original PS2 version of the game, the same North American version I'd played originally, so that's where I started. It's funny how details come back to you even after many years from something that originally made an impression. I found myself remembering rooms and layouts, some puzzles, but certainly not all the specifics. This version, at least on native hardware, is really low resolution. Even when the game originally released, I think it was considered technically lacking, and it certainly looks dated in that respect today. Taking advantage of some of today's technology, however, can substantially improve it to the point where it seems almost contemporary. Shortcomings in draw distance and texturing are still noticeable. The high contrast scenes, bright sun, and signature color palette were all there as I remembered, the enemy shadows striking against the pastel scenes. The final encounter with the Dark Queen was one of the sequences I still remembered most vividly after all these years, and it remained amazing. I had a PS1 but got it late in its life cycle, and never played games like Final Fantasy VII and VIII at all, or Metal Gear Solid until well after its original release. I don't think at the time I was very accustomed to the particle effects that the early PlayStation consoles could produce, and the artistic style applied here was incredibly memorable. It still resonates with me today. The soundtrack has some really memorable tracks, joyful on occasion, largely somber and haunting, made more impactful by the overall minimalist approach to sound design. The castle that you spend the game navigating is a character of its own. There are familiar elements to the physical architecture found throughout, but also magical ones, complex mechanisms, caves, and waterways. Everything is pretty unique and nothing remains too similar for long, though elements like the two arenas and reflectors that you visit to activate the main gate do repeat, albeit with their own puzzle variations. As a precursor to Shadow of the Colossus, scale features prominently in the adventure, with characters appearing small against the environments they find themselves in, and the vistas around them. The environment is believable somehow for a castle of pure obstacles. Pathways connect to each other, circle back, reconnect. You'll traverse large areas and find yourself back near where you started, but somewhere previously unreachable, now connected back to your earlier path. You need to use this knowledge to navigate and find your way, although there's only ever really one direction to be moving. This sort of consistency and connectedness is something I've come to love in other games that do it well. The surprise of ending up somewhere familiar when you thought you were off on an hours-long journey somewhere else entirely. Puzzle solving and navigating these environments is a constant. When you first enter many areas, the possibilities may seem overwhelming. In reality, there aren't too many options, and you learn the ways in which you can count on interacting with things. By experimenting, you'll adeptly make your way from the entrance to the exit one step at a time, and find that things always fall into place to move you along in a satisfying and rewarding way. There can be missteps, the most painful of which might result in a falling death toward the end of a sequence that then completely resets for you to repeat without that same sense of discovery that pulled you along the first time. In reality, though, these frustrations are fairly brief, since the game as a whole and each area can be traversed quickly once you've figured out what you're doing. It's friction, but not friction I found to be too frequent or spoiling, if you try to be careful and somewhat patient. There are a few areas that pose a pretty tricky challenge. You can look around, but the camera control is largely automated and hints at useful points of view or objects of interest. However, you'll learn that these can be intentionally misleading at times. It's usually these few cases that had me stuck for a bit. There's the first room where you have to figure out how to swing on a chain, not something I recall the game explaining. That one tripped me up the most this time, along with a much later room I'll call pipes, that tricks you with an unreliable camera angle if you're not careful. There's the simple pressure switch room that plays with perspective just enough to hide the obvious solution. That's the one that really got me on my first play all those years ago, and I still remember it today, enough that this time I rediscovered the solution quickly. Combat is a more sporadic element, but nonetheless fairly prevalent. It can be quite intense, especially early on. I think a couple of the most difficult encounters occur in the first quarter or third of the game, when your only defense is a wooden plank. Enemies can be numerous. Be careful not to overextend with your attacks when surrounded. The enemies will absolutely swarm you and synchronize attacks when they see you're vulnerable, otherwise dancing outside of your range. Being knocked down takes multiple seconds to recover from, and can be enough time to lose Yorda and maybe not make it to her in time, especially when flying enemies are involved and you happen to be in an inopportune spot. Singular strikes are effective to be quick and put enemies off balance, so you can move or grab Yorda from the shadow portals. You'll have to estimate how much longer you have to pull her out before it's game over, another element that adds intensity. The combat is uncharacteristically stressful for a game that is otherwise pretty meditative and relaxed. It certainly introduces a real feeling of danger and uncertainty that otherwise doesn't exist. I also think it's the most frustrating element of the game. Fortunately, these encounters seem to get easier as you get deeper. You can still get unlucky and find yourself in a bad position, but not only do you find a new tool to help you fight, you also get a feel for things and learn some tactics to deal with the different enemies. Not allowing Yorda to get grabbed and captured at all, and judging when you can run from encounters and when you must clear them, leads to a lot more confidence in navigating these sections without loss of progress. The worst is certainly when combat is sprung on you after a lengthy sequence of puzzle solving and you fail, only to have to redo everything you just struggled through. In these cases, remember at least that you know what you have to do now. Remembering my past experience with some of the combat encounters, I wasn't relishing going through that again. I don't remember ever feeling comfortable with them originally. This time, I took my time and learned more about how they played out, even if it took some trial and error. This was a better experience. While not the most enjoyable parts usually, I didn't dread the fights, and they essentially became a non-issue. They are one of the least refined parts of the game, and that became especially clear after I finished my first run and learned there were changes made in later versions. I had such a good time that I wanted to play the game again right away, even though there aren't any secrets I'm aware of and no New Game Plus mode that changes anything. It seemed like a great opportunity then to try the PS3 version. The HD collection of Ico and Shadow of the Colossus released back in 2011. This one I remember more clearly. I picked up a hard copy of the collection right away. It was a busy time, but even if I wasn't able to sit down and play it for a while, I liked both games so much that I wanted to support the release. It's sort of silly to admit, but I ended up never getting around to it. Given my schedule in those years, it was tough to spend time playing a game I'd already played when it was all I could do to try to keep up with a few of the biggest new games that interested me each year. These were primarily the latest Monster Hunter and From Software releases in those days. So finally, well over a decade after even the re-release of the game, I sat down with the HD version of Ico. Immediately, the game looked fantastic, at least compared to the original running on a PS2. The resolution was substantially improved, even sporting a native 1080p mode. Almost right from the start, though, there were notable lighting differences. Gone is the really high contrast of the outdoor scenes and the vibrant, recognizable color palette that was so characteristic of the original. The game is frankly dark throughout, but especially in interior environments. Brightness is adjustable in the options, and I had to knock it up at least 3 notches to make things visible across all the different interior areas. I could see many preferring this perhaps, with deeper blacks and a less washed out look. Even with the brightness increased, I got stuck a little longer than I should have in one of the arena areas, because I forgot what door I needed to go through at one point. The door itself was essentially lost in shadow. It's a strange difference in an otherwise very faithful recreation of the game. It could be a more modern artistic choice, but could also be a factor of the different hardware or engine the game is now running on. I think this is a loss of one of the unique elements of the original game, so experiencing that version if you can is still interesting, but the effect on the overall game experience is moderate. More significantly, I started to notice a number of subtle differences in a few areas. Yorda behaved a little bit differently, sometimes drawing your attention to the path forward, or something of interest in the current room. She jumped across at least some gaps on her own when called, rather than Ico always having to catch her. She seemed to react and move a little bit quicker. She also avoided enemies more capably in combat, at least sometimes. She'd even shake her head and say no if you called her from a place she couldn't reach. Combat tuning felt different, too. Enemies were easier to dispatch, even early on with the wooden plank. Melee range seemed increased. You could still get surrounded and get in trouble, but things felt less stressful. Enemies behaved a little bit differently too, but more cautious to approach. The locations of the shadow portals where Yorda can be trapped changed in some rooms, and one of the basic enemy types had a new ability to sink into the ground and hide. They couldn't be hit in this state, so I just switched targets and hit something else until they popped out again. A few rooms even had slightly different structure. Some of these seemed like purely visual differences, like balconies that overlooked a previous room instead of bricked-over windows. Others altered puzzles in fairly substantial ways, such as the waterfall sequence in the second half of the game. There's a water wheel in the trench you have to use to get across and block the water in this version. Just before that, rather than climbing across a pipe to exit a room through a high window, you need to jump on this piston device that launches you upward instead. There's also a secret room to find behind a wall in that same area. Some of these, like the combat changes, made sense to me as things they might revisit and improve for a remaster. Others, like the puzzle changes, seemed weirdly sporadic. I'm not certain if some of these changes are unique to the HD version, but doing a little research I found that the HD version is based on the PAL version of the original game, which I've never played. It was the last version of the game to release back in the early 2000s, and sported many if not all of these very same changes. I've only ever been familiar with the NA version, that was apparently more rushed to make a late 2001 release, and was missing some of these intended elements and extra polish. The nature of these changes made a lot more sense with this context, and they also felt more like experiencing the final intended version of the game rather than a remaster with altered elements. Either way, Fumito Ueda himself was involved in the HD version based on the credits. Overall, across its fairly modest duration, I think Ico holds up really well. The game felt very much the same to me as it did when I first played it over 20 years ago. It had the same overwhelmingly positive and unique elements, as well as the same occasional bits of frustration with combat and repetition after inopportune failures. Today, there are many games that have taken inspiration from Ico, and a greater variety of game experiences exist, especially across independent games. Some players might find elements of Ico that were kind of groundbreaking originally less so today. Nevertheless, even if you don't have a history with the game, I'd encourage you to check it out if it sounds even a little bit interesting. Replaying the original took me 7 or 8 hours, but with the path fresher in my mind, the HD version took me maybe half that. It's not a big commitment, whether you end up seeing it through or not. What might be more of a commitment, unfortunately, is finding a way to play the game. Shadow of the Colossus saw another re-release on PS4, making it readily available today on that platform or the PS5, thanks to its backwards compatibility. Ico only appears on the PS2 and PS3, older systems that current ones aren't backwards compatible with. At some point it sounds like Ico was available on the PlayStation Now streaming service, but that no longer exists, and Ico doesn't seem to be available through the current PS Plus game catalog or Classics library. That doesn't leave many options aside from original hardware and discs. Given that, No doubt the PS3 HD version is the most accessible as far as acquisition, digital or physical, and playability. I'd recommend this version, but acquiring an old system or disc, if you don't already have them around, is probably a pricey prospect. It's too bad Ico is stuck in this state, for those that want to play it legitimately and in its original form. And with that, I'll wrap this up and say that I had a lot of fun with this little project. While this video has taken me a while to get together, I've made good progress this month on both the PS2 and PS3 versions of Shadow of the Colossus, and I'm at least halfway through The Last Guardian. I look forward to figuring out some way, maybe more efficiently, to get some Shadow of the Colossus content onto the channel. That's a game I remember as one of my favorites of all time, and another pretty singular gaming experience, even today. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you so much for watching. If you like reminiscing about games, consider throwing a comment below, hitting that thumbs up or thumbs down, and subscribing to the channel. And of course, until next time, take care.